The sound of sirens, a mother's frantic voice desperately trying to explain, the confusion, the disbelief, an innocent mistake that spirals into a nightmare. This is the moment everything changed. Imagine the fear of watching your disabled daughter, someone who depends on a wheelchair for mobility, have it taken away from her. Why? Because a neighbor, Karen, called animal control, mistakenly thinking that her wheelchair was stolen property. For a moment, I was frozen. Was this really happening? How could anyone, let alone an authority figure, assume that a disabled child's wheelchair, her lifeline, was a mere object of theft? And how could they just take it from her without a second thought? It wasn't just a mistake. It was an assault on her dignity. It was the heartbreaking reality of how easily people make assumptions based on nothing but ignorance and prejudice. As my daughter sat there helpless, with tears in her eyes, I realized something far deeper than a simple mix-up was at play. It was about the way we see people who are different, how they're often misunderstood and mistreated because of it. This isn't just my story, it's the story of countless others who faced unfair judgments and discriminatory actions simply because of their appearance or their condition. But this wasn't just about the wheelchair. It was about everything that led to that moment. The lack of compassion, the cruelty of assumption, and the need for us all to take a step back and think before we act. What happens when a simple call to animal control shatters a child's trust in the world around her? Stick with me, and let's uncover the reality behind this shocking incident. Before that fateful day, life was simple for our family. We were a close-knit unit, always focused on the little things that made each day meaningful. My daughter Lily is an amazing child, smart, full of life, and full of dreams. She was born with a disability that requires her to use a wheelchair to get around, but that's never stopped her from living life to the fullest. We've always focused on her strengths rather than her limitations, creating a home filled with laughter, learning, and love. Our days were like any other family's, morning routines of getting ready for school, shared meals at the kitchen table, evening talks about her day, and plenty of playtime in the backyard. We made sure to keep things normal, adjusting our lives around her needs. Lily's wheelchair wasn't just a piece of equipment to us, it was her freedom. It allowed her to explore, engage, and move about the world with confidence. It wasn't just metal and wheels, it was the key to her independence. But that day, everything changed. It all began when Karen, a neighbor from down the street, saw us outside. She'd always been a bit too involved in everyone's business, though we tried to stay polite. For some reason, Karen had taken it upon herself to look out for our family, or rather, she thought she knew better about what was right for Lily. We had always kept a respectful distance, exchanging pleasantries when we crossed paths, but nothing more. Little did we know, Karen had been observing us from afar, and it was about to cost us dearly. It wasn't long before we received a call from Animal Control. At first, I was confused. Why would they be calling us? The last thing I imagined was that my daughter's wheelchair had somehow become the center of controversy. Karen, in her misguided sense of concern, had called Animal Control, assuming that Lily's wheelchair was somehow stolen. She claimed that the wheelchair didn't look like something a child with a disability would use, that it was too nice and looked like property theft. How could anyone, especially someone who knew our family, believe something so outrageous? At that point, I was already on edge. Karen had gone far too far. The moment she called Animal Control, it felt like the world was against us. The authority figures arrived shortly after, not with concern or understanding, but with suspicion and cold authority. They didn't take the time to ask questions or understand the situation. Instead, they just assumed the worst. The moment they laid their hands on Lily's wheelchair, everything inside me snapped. My daughter was in tears, confused and scared. She couldn't understand why the people who were supposed to protect her were now taking away her most important possession. Her wheelchair wasn't just an object, it was a vital part of her life. To see it being treated as something less than that was a betrayal. As I rushed to intervene, the situation escalated. The animal control officers were just doing their job, but Karen's reckless call had turned this into something bigger than any of us anticipated. The entire event was a clash between what people thought they knew and what was real. It was a painful reminder of how easily assumptions can be made, especially when people don't take the time to understand others. For Lily, it wasn't just about the wheelchair, it was about trust. Trust in the people around her, trust in the authorities, and trust in the world she was navigating. And in that one moment, all of that trust was shattered. This was not just a misunderstanding, it was a glaring example of how, in our society, people with disabilities can be so easily marginalized and misunderstood. It was a wake up call for us, a moment that would forever change how we viewed our own community and the way we interacted with those around us. What happened that day wasn't just a mix up, it was a story of how our world needs more compassion, more understanding, and more respect for those who are different. The moment the animal control officers arrived, everything took a turn for the worse. We had been outside in our front yard, Lily in her wheelchair, enjoying the mild afternoon sunshine. I had no reason to think that anything was wrong until the sound of a car pulling up in front of our house broke through the calm. The two officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and their faces unreadable. They didn't even glance at us before heading straight toward Lily's wheelchair. I stood frozen for a second, trying to understand what was happening. A sense of unease washed over me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Lily, completely unaware, smiled up at me, unaware of the storm that was about to engulf us. I walked toward the officers, trying to put a stop to whatever this was before it got worse. One of the officers, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke first, his voice almost too formal. "Is this your daughter's wheelchair?" he asked, eyes scanning Lily's wheelchair, as if it were a criminal object. "Yes, it is," I replied, confusion seeping into my words. "What's going on? Why are you here?" The officer glanced over at his partner, who stood a few feet back, keeping a distance as if uncertain. It was as though they were unsure of the next move. The first officer turned back to me, his tone changing slightly. "We received a call, ma'am. A report that this wheelchair was taken without permission. We need to verify that it's yours." My heart dropped. A cold, nervous laughter bubbled in my throat. "Taken? What are you talking about?" I demanded, stepping closer, trying to make sense of the absurdity of the situation. My eyes darted to Karen's house, where I saw her peering out from behind a curtain, her face the picture of someone who had done nothing wrong. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to shout, to tell her how much damage her careless assumption was causing. But instead, I turned back to the officer, trying to keep my composure. "Ma'am, this is serious. We need to verify the ownership of this wheelchair," the officer said again, his voice firm, unwavering. I could feel my pulse quicken. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was becoming something far more serious. The officers weren't here to help. They weren't trying to understand. They were acting on the assumption that something criminal was happening in front of them. I could see it in their eyes. The skepticism, the doubt. They didn't even look at Lily, didn't ask if she was okay, if she needed anything. Instead, they just eyed the wheelchair like it was a stolen object. "Do you have any paperwork?" the officer asked, his tone shifting slightly from inquisitive to authoritative. I blinked, confused. "Paperwork? No, I don't carry around paperwork for my daughter's wheelchair. It's hers. She needs it. Why are you asking me this? What is going on?" The second officer stepped forward, his gaze now fixed on Lily. I could tell he was uncomfortable, but his discomfort didn't make him any less dangerous. "It's standard procedure, ma'am. If this is your daughter's wheelchair, you should have documentation. We need to verify that it belongs to her." I felt a rush of anger boil inside me. It was as if they were treating me like a criminal, like I was trying to pull off some kind of scam. My daughter was in front of me, her life dependent on that wheelchair, and they were questioning its ownership as though it was something that could just be taken away. "But it's hers. Can't you see that she's disabled?" I snapped, pointing to Lily, who was now looking at me with confusion written on her face. "She needs this. It's not just a chair. It's her lifeline." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a glance with his partner, who nodded slightly. It was like they were having an internal conversation I wasn't privy to, deciding if they should proceed with their line of questioning or just move along. The second officer finally spoke up, his voice still cold and mechanical. "We can't take any chances. We need to take the chair for further inspection. It could be stolen property." I shook my head, disbelief flooding my mind. "No, no, you can't take her chair. It's not just some object. She needs it." Lily began to squirm in her seat, sensing the tension in the air. Her hands gripped the armrests of the chair as if to protect it, as if to shield herself from the threat of losing something that was part of her. Her eyes began to water, but she remained silent, unsure of how to process what was happening. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that in front of my eyes, they were about to take my daughter's wheelchair. Our wheelchair. The very same one that had allowed her to navigate the world on her own terms. How had it come to this? How had a simple misunderstanding turned into an attack on our family's dignity? The officer moved toward Lily, his hand outstretched, ready to lift the chair from beneath her. It was as if everything in the world slowed down. The panic set in. My voice, sharp and desperate, broke the silence. "No!" I shouted, my hands reaching out to stop him. "You can't take it. You can't take her chair." The officer paused, eyeing me with a mixture of annoyance and suspicion. "Ma'am, step back. We have our orders." My pulse was racing now. Orders? Orders to take away a disabled child's wheelchair because of a mistake? What kind of world are we living in? The second officer, who had been quiet up until this point, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job." "Your job?" I spat, my emotions surging. "Your job is to help people, not to take away a child's ability to move around. Her life depends on this chair." I could feel my voice trembling now, a mixture of anger and fear rising within me. The scene was starting to draw attention from our neighbors. A few curious onlookers gathered around, drawn by the commotion. I saw Karen standing in the doorway of her house, watching with a self-satisfied look on her face. She didn't move to intervene. She didn't seem to care. Instead, she watched as the authorities continued to push forward with their assumption. The more I protested, the more they seemed to dig in their heels. The officers weren't backing down, and Karen wasn't speaking up. It was just me, standing there, fighting with everything I had to protect my daughter. I could feel the walls closing in around us. The stakes were higher now. It wasn't just about the wheelchair anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to be treated as a human being. It was about standing up against an unjust situation when no one else seemed to care. The tension was unbearable. It was like time had stopped, and I was caught in an endless loop of trying to reason with people who weren't listening, people who couldn't see what I saw, who couldn't understand that this was not just about a chair, but about the well-being of my child. At that moment, I knew that the story wasn't going to end here. Something had to change. I had to make it clear that this wasn't a situation I would let slide by quietly. I wasn't going to allow them to take away Lily's right to her chair without a fight. The emotional stakes had never been higher. This was about my daughter's future, and I wasn't backing down. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. The air was thick with tension, charged with the raw, unsettling energy of an irreversible act unfolding before my eyes. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, the rapid beats echoing in my ears as I stared helplessly at the animal control officers. Their cold hands reached out, not with any sense of care, but with the decisive authority of people who believed they were doing the right thing, no matter the cost. And the cost at that moment was my daughter's dignity, her sense of security, and the one thing that gave her the ability to live independently, her wheelchair. I could see the officer's fingers close around the handles of the wheelchair, lifting it away from Lily, as though it were just another object to be handled and dealt with. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel the same pain I felt. To them, it was just another routine task to check off. But for us, it was the most crucial thing in our lives. This wheelchair was not an object, it was a lifeline. Without it, Lily couldn't move, couldn't explore the world, couldn't experience life in the way she had come to understand it. Lily's face was a mixture of confusion and fear. She had no idea what was happening. Her tiny hands gripped the armrests of the chair as though trying to hold onto the world, trying to hold onto the last shred of normalcy that had been her reality for so long. As the officer lifted the chair, she let out a soft, trembling cry, one that cut through the air like a dagger to my heart. "Mom, what's happening? Why are they taking my chair?" Lily asked, her voice a fragile whisper, her eyes wide with panic. I froze, unable to answer her. I couldn't form the words to explain what was happening. How could I? How could I explain that the people who were supposed to help her were now the ones making her feel vulnerable, helpless, and broken? Her face crumpled with distress, and my heart shattered. It wasn't just the act of taking her chair, it was the look in her eyes, the uncertainty that flooded them. She didn't understand why she was being treated this way. She was just a child, and the last thing she should be feeling was fear. Fear of the very system that was supposed to protect her. Fear of the people who were supposed to ensure her safety, her comfort, and her right to live a dignified life. "Please don't take it," Lily whispered again, her voice trembling. In that moment, I realized that the pain of losing her wheelchair wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional, and deeply personal. It wasn't just a chair. It was her confidence, her freedom, and her peace of mind. It was the very thing that allowed her to navigate the world in the same way her peers did. Without it, she would be confined, trapped, as if locked away in a prison of her own body. I couldn't stand there any longer and do nothing. The helplessness inside me turned into a raw, burning anger. The officers were focused on the chair, oblivious to the emotional devastation they were causing. My daughter's tear-streaked face, her desperate plea for something so simple, her wheelchair, was all but ignored. Without thinking, I stepped forward, my voice rising in a desperate plea. "Stop, please. This is her chair. You can't just take it away. She needs it. She needs it to survive." The officers paused, but only for a brief second. The tall one, the one who had spoken the most, turned to me with a stern expression. "Ma'am, we have to ensure this is your property. We can't just let it go without confirming its ownership." My blood boiled. I could feel my skin prickle with the heat of rage, but I pushed it down. It wasn't just about the chair anymore. It was about standing up for my daughter, standing up for her rights, for her dignity. "She's disabled." I shouted, the words feeling foreign as they left my mouth, desperate. "This is not just a piece of furniture. This is the one thing that lets her live her life. You can't just take it away from her." My voice cracked, the weight of the words pressing on me, making me feel smaller, weaker in front of these figures of authority. But I refused to back down. I couldn't back down. Not when my daughter was looking at me, her face filled with the same confusion and fear that had paralyzed me. Lily's small voice broke through the air, once more, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mom, please don't let them take it. I can't walk without it, please." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Her vulnerability, her trust in me, was everything. She didn't understand the injustice she was facing, but she trusted me to protect her from it. She trusted me to make things right, and I wasn't about to let her down. I turned back to the officers, fury boiling inside me. "This is not happening," I said, my voice low but full of authority. "You will not take her chair. You will not take away her independence. I will not let you do this." The officers exchanged a look. There was hesitation now, but it wasn't enough. I could see the gears turning in their heads, their minds calculating what to do next. They had been given orders, and orders were something they followed without question. But in this moment, those orders clashed with the human decency I had hoped they would bring with them. The only thing that mattered to them was following the protocol, and I could see it in their eyes. They weren't seeing my daughter as a human being. They weren't seeing her as a child who needed help. They were just seeing an object to be seized. Suddenly, the sound of a car door slamming shut rang through the air. A voice broke through the mounting tension. It was Karen. I hadn't noticed her come outside, but now she was standing at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a cold, detached interest. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice sugary sweet, though I could see the faintest smirk playing on her lips. "Is everything okay?" I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to ask her why she'd done this to us, why she'd gone so far to cause such a devastating situation. But I couldn't. I was too angry, too broken. Instead, I turned to the officers and pointed at Karen. "This is the person who called you here. She made this mess. She's the reason my daughter is being treated like this." Karen's expression remained unchanged, almost satisfied. "I was just concerned. I thought there was something wrong with the chair," she said, her voice oozing with feigned concern. Concern? This wasn't concern. This was cruelty masked as a well-intentioned act. She had no idea what it felt like to watch your child suffer, to watch them experience fear and confusion because of someone else's ignorance. The officers finally seemed to understand that something wasn't right. They paused, and for the first time, they began to look at Lily, really look at her. They saw the tears in her eyes, the way her tiny hands were shaking as she held onto the armrests of her wheelchair. They saw the fear, and it made them hesitate. But it was too late for hesitation. The damage had been done. Lily was still looking up at me, her face wet with tears, her voice small but strong. "Mom, please don't let them take my chair." I knelt down beside her, my heart breaking as I looked into her eyes. "I won't, baby. I promise. I won't let them take your chair." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently, trying to reassure her. But the words were hollow. How could I reassure her when everything around us was falling apart? How could I protect her from something that was out of my control? It wasn't just the wheelchair they were taking, it was her sense of safety, her trust in the world. And that I couldn't fix. The officers, at last, turned to Karen. She had nothing more to say. Her concern had been laid bare, and it was just as hollow as her actions. "We'll be taking our leave now," the officer said, his voice now tinged with uncertainty. "But we will be making a report. You may need to prove ownership of the chair later." The words barely registered as I nodded, still holding Lily's hand. The officers left without another word, but the damage had already been done. As they drove away, leaving nothing but the echoes of their tires on the pavement, I finally let out the breath I had been holding in, but it wasn't a sigh of relief. It was a sigh of defeat. The scene had barely settled before a storm of thoughts and emotions surged through me. After the officers left, I found myself standing in the middle of the front yard, still in disbelief, holding Lily's trembling hand. She was quiet now, but her eyes told a different story, a story of fear, confusion, and a broken trust in the world around her. As I gazed at her, I realized that while the officers had taken the physical wheelchair, the real damage done wasn't just the physical separation of Lily from her freedom. It was the emotional and psychological toll it had taken on both of us, but especially on her. She had been treated like a criminal, like a suspect, as though her condition, her disability, and her needs were nothing but a misunderstanding. Her chair, her lifeline, had been reduced to a mere object, a commodity whose worth could be questioned. It was as though her entire identity, her ability to live freely, was suddenly being scrutinized, torn apart, and misunderstood. But it wasn't just her that needed healing. It was me too. I had to pick up the pieces of my own shattered belief in the system. I had trusted the authorities to protect us, to help us, and instead, they had been complicit in the very injustice we were fighting against. This was a situation born not out of malice, but of ignorance, and it was that ignorance that I needed to confront head on, not just in the officers, but in all of us. As I watched Lily slowly regain some semblance of calm, I realized that the journey of healing had already begun. In the midst of the chaos and confusion, there was still room for growth, room to learn from this experience, to educate others, and to ensure that no one would ever have to go through what we had just endured. The days following the incident were filled with emotional turmoil. The weight of what had happened hung over us like a thick cloud. My phone rang more than I wanted it to, with people offering their support, sharing their sympathy, or, in some cases, questioning how things had escalated the way they did. But amidst the noise, I knew there was one thing that needed to happen. My daughter needed her wheelchair back. It wasn't just about reclaiming an object, it was about reclaiming her sense of agency, her freedom. After several phone calls and emails, I managed to get in touch with the animal control officers who had come that day. They were apologetic, acknowledging the mistake, and they promised to return the wheelchair as soon as possible. But I knew that an apology alone wasn't enough. This was more than just a mix-up. It was a reminder of how easily we misjudge people, how easily we let assumptions cloud our judgment. When the officer arrived to return the wheelchair, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of closure, but also a bitter taste of frustration. He placed the wheelchair carefully on the porch, his demeanor softened by the weight of the situation. His face was no longer filled with the stern professionalism of authority. Instead, it was marked with a sort of regret. "I'm truly sorry for what happened," he said, looking down at the wheelchair. "I understand now why you reacted the way you did." I nodded, but there was no relief in the words. The apology didn't erase the pain Lily had felt, the fear she had experienced, nor the indignity we had both endured. It didn't undo the damage to our sense of trust in those who were supposed to help. But I knew that this was a starting point, a way forward. Lily, who had been watching silently from the porch, slowly wheeled herself toward the chair. There was a hesitance in her movements, a wariness that had not been there before. It was heartbreaking to watch the subtle change in her demeanor as she sat back down, adjusting to the chair with the caution of someone who had been hurt before. She didn't speak for a long time, just quietly sat in the wheelchair, her hands resting on the armrests, her eyes staring out at the front yard. I knelt beside her, placing my hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I asked gently, my voice softer than I had ever meant it to be. She turned her head to look at me, her eyes heavy with emotion. "I'm okay, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I was scared. I kissed the top of her head, feeling a lump in my throat. "I know, baby. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You didn't deserve any of it." In that moment, I realized that no matter how much I tried to protect her, the world would always throw obstacles in her way. Obstacles that she would have to face, obstacles that would test her resilience. And while I couldn't shield her from every hurt, every moment of confusion, I could give her the tools to stand strong, to face the world with grace and strength. But the story wasn't over. The real challenge, the part that still haunted me, was confronting Karen, the neighbor whose call had set everything in motion. I had avoided confronting her for days. I didn't want to face her, to acknowledge the damage her assumptions had caused. But deep down, I knew that without addressing it, without confronting the source of the misunderstanding, we wouldn't truly move forward. I decided to knock on her door. My heart raced as I stood in front of it, knowing that this conversation would be uncomfortable to say the least. But I had no choice. It was time for accountability. It was time for Karen to understand the consequences of her actions. When she answered the door, she seemed caught off guard, though I wasn't sure why. Perhaps she had expected us to stay silent, to let the incident fade into the background. But I was done with silence. I was done with letting people get away with their mistakes without realizing the impact they had. "Karen, we need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You need to understand the damage you caused. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a violation of my daughter's dignity." She looked taken aback, but I could see the walls coming up. She wasn't ready for this conversation. She wasn't prepared to admit any wrong, and yet I knew I had to push forward. "I thought I was just helping," she said, her tone defensive. "I was just concerned. I saw that wheelchair and it didn't look right." "You didn't see anything?" I replied, my voice rising. "You made an assumption based on nothing but your own prejudice. You didn't think to ask, to check, to understand. You took away my daughter's safety, her security, and you didn't even care." She shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she looked down, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. I could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to undo the harm she had caused. "You have to understand something. I continued, trying to steady my emotions. What you did wasn't just an innocent mistake, it was a violation of trust. You saw my daughter and you saw her wheelchair, and you immediately assumed she didn't belong. But she does. She belongs in this world, just like everyone else. And the next time you decide to help, I want you to remember the harm that your actions can cause. Karen looked up at me, her eyes meeting mine for the first time, and I saw something shift, something that might have been guilt or even shame. But whatever it was, it didn't undo the damage. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, she whispered, her voice almost breaking. I know you didn't, I said, my tone softening just a little. But you did, and it's important that you understand the impact of your actions. She nodded silently, her face flushed with regret. I didn't know if it was enough to change her, but at least she understood now. At least I had given her the opportunity to recognize the harm that had been done. As the days went by, the emotional weight of what had happened began to ease, but the lessons were still fresh in my mind. The incident had opened my eyes to the biases and prejudices that people, including myself, often carry without realizing it. It had shown me how easily assumptions can turn into harmful actions and how quickly a small misunderstanding can spiral into a life-changing event. But it also taught me something else: the power of advocacy, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the strength that can be found in vulnerability. I knew that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger conversation about empathy, about understanding, about recognizing that the world is made up of diverse people with diverse needs. It was a reminder that we have to question our assumptions, challenge our biases, and always consider the impact our actions have on others. For Lily, the incident was an emotional scar, but it was also a moment of growth. She became more aware of the world around her, more resilient in the face of adversity. She learned that even when the world doesn't understand her, she has a voice and she has the right to stand up for herself. And as for me, I learned that sometimes the fight isn't just about winning. It's about teaching others, about raising awareness, about making sure that the people around us understand the importance of empathy. It's about ensuring that incidents like this don't happen again, that no one else has to face the cruelty of judgment and ignorance. The world, as I now understand it, can be a harsh place, but in the end, it's our responsibility to make it a kinder one. Through advocacy, through understanding, and through compassion, we can begin to change the narrative, one small act of empathy at a time. The moment I stood there, holding my daughter's hand, watching the officers drive away, a part of me broke. But it wasn't just the shock of the event, it was the realization that this moment wasn't isolated. It was a reflection of something much deeper in society: the assumption that people who are different somehow don't belong. The incident with Lily's wheelchair wasn't just about the physical object, it was about the bigger issue of how society often views those with disabilities, how we sometimes fail to see people for who they truly are. We see what we want to see, and that's the tragedy. We make decisions based on assumptions, not facts, and we let ignorance dictate our actions. As I held my daughter, trying to calm her shaken spirit, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had experienced this. How many others had felt the sting of being misunderstood, of being judged based on their differences, whether it was their disability, their appearance, or their identity. How many other parents had fought to protect their children, not just from physical harm, but from the emotional and psychological damage caused by the world's inability to see beyond the surface. And that's where the true power of this story lies, not in the wheelchair, but in the lessons it taught me and the lessons I hope it will teach others. We live in a world where judgments are made quickly, where assumptions are often the default, and where empathy is sometimes in short supply. But this is the world we have the power to change. I remember the look on Lily's face, the confusion, the fear, and the vulnerability. That image is forever etched in my mind. She was just a little girl, caught in a whirlwind of misunderstanding, and all she wanted was to live her life. But this world wasn't making that easy for her. It wasn't making it easy for anyone who didn't fit the mold of what society deems normal. But here's the thing: change begins with us. Change begins with the decisions we make every day to treat others with dignity, to look beyond our prejudices, and to take a step back before we judge. It starts with raising our voices, even when it feels uncomfortable, and speaking up when we see injustice. Because if we don't, who will? If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that we can't just sit back and hope things will get better. We need to be the ones who make that change. We need to be the ones who show empathy, who teach our children how to be compassionate, and who create a world where everyone belongs, no matter their abilities, their differences, or their circumstances. We need to change the narrative, shift the conversation from ignorance to understanding, from assumption to acceptance. This isn't just about one wheelchair. This is about the countless others who are overlooked, dismissed, and ignored because they don't fit into society's narrow definition of what is acceptable. This is about the need to advocate for those who can't always speak for themselves, about making sure that every voice is heard and every life is valued. So, to everyone watching this video, I ask you to reflect on your own biases. Think about the times when you've made assumptions without understanding the full picture. How often do we judge others based on the way they look, the way they speak, or the way they live their lives? How often do we dismiss their struggles because they don't align with our own? We all have work to do. We all need to question our assumptions and open our hearts to the reality of others' experiences. And to those of you who have faced similar struggles, who have felt the sting of judgment or the weight of others' ignorance, I want you to know that you're not alone. Your story matters. Your voice matters. You deserve to live your life with dignity, respect, and the freedom to be yourself, without fear of being misunderstood or mistreated. It's time to raise our voices, to take action, and to create a world where everyone is seen for who they truly are. A world where no one has to fight for their place, where no one has to explain why they deserve to be treated with respect. A world where empathy, understanding, and compassion are the driving forces behind everything we do.